Beneath the streets of Manhattan, 7,300 workers descended into darkness to build the first subway system in America. The New York City subway opened on October 27, 1904. On the first day of operation, 150,000 people paid a nickel each to ride the 9.1-mile underground line from City Hall to 145th Street in Harlem. The engineering was celebrated as a marvel, the first underground rapid transit system in the Western Hemisphere, a triumph of human ingenuity and technological achievement. But here's what most people don't know. Directly beneath where those tunnels were dug lies a burial ground. Not just any burial ground, the Manhattan Burial Ground, a cemetery where thousands of African Americans, immigrants, and enslaved people were buried between the 1700s and the 19th century. When workers began excavating the tunnels, they encountered human remains, bones, coffins, entire burial vaults. The city's response was to cover it up. Workers were instructed to say nothing. The bodies were reburied hastily or discarded, and the entire incident was systematically erased from every history book written about the New York City subway for over 100 years. This is the story of what was built beneath our feet and what was destroyed in the process. In the 1860s, New York City faced a transportation crisis. The city's population was exploding. By 1900, nearly 3.5 million people lived on the island of Manhattan. Elevated railways had been built starting in the late 1860s, but they created chaos at street level. Steam and smoke filled the air. Noise was constant. As pedestrians, horses, and early automobiles competed for space on city streets, congestion became unbearable. City planners looked at London, which had opened an underground transit system in 1863. London's solution was elegant: move transit beneath the streets. By the 1890s, the idea of a New York City subway was being seriously discussed. But there was a massive problem: money. Building a subway would cost millions of dollars. The city didn't have the funds. Private companies showed little interest because they would operate the system under municipal control, meaning limited profits. For years, the subway remained a dream. Then, in 1900, a financier named August Belmont Jr. stepped forward. Belmont was wealthy and well-connected. He agreed to finance and oversee the construction of the subway. The Rapid Transit Construction Company, headed by John B. McDonald, was contracted to do the actual building. On March 24, 1900, ground was broken in a ceremony at City Hall. The project was announced as a triumph of civic vision and private enterprise. The tunnels from City Hall to 145th Street would run for 9.1 miles. The route had been carefully planned to move people from downtown Manhattan northward through the Bronx scale before. 7,300 workers, mostly immigrants living in Manhattan, were hired for the construction. They were paid minimal wages and given minimal safety equipment. The construction method was called cut and cover. Workers would dig deep trenches to excavate the tunnel. Steel and wooden bridges would carry street traffic above the excavation while work continued. The process required rerouting 12 miles of sewers. It meant moving water and gas mains, electric conduits, and steam pipes. Street railways had to be torn up. The foundations of buildings often ran near the excavation. In some cases, the foundations had to be strengthened with additional support. The streets of Manhattan were in a constant state of disruption from 1900 to 1904. Traffic was chaotic. Businesses along the route complained bitterly about the construction. Residents were displaced. It was a massive, disruptive project. But the real problems occurred underground. In the sections where the subway ran beneath parks or deep tunnels, workers faced different challenges. They had to dig through rock and gravel. Groundwater was a constant problem. The deeper the excavation, the more water there was. Pumps had to run continuously. Underground, conditions were dark, dangerous, and disease-ridden. The air was foul. Diseases spread rapidly through work crews living in cramped quarters. One of the most intriguing mysteries of NYC subway construction involves what happened when workers began excavating beneath City Hall and in the downtown Manhattan area. This region had been the site of massive cemeteries: the Negro Potter's Field, the Manhattan Burial Ground. These cemeteries had been used for decades, particularly for African American burials and burials of poor immigrants who couldn't afford cemetery plots in other locations. By 1900, when subway construction began, these cemeteries were officially closed, but many people didn't know they existed at all. The locations had been deliberately obscured in city records. When workers excavated the tunnels, they encountered something unexpected: human remains, lots of them. Skeletons, coffins, in some places, layers of remains stacked together. The workers reported these discoveries to their supervisors. What happened next was silence. The Rapid Transit Construction Company issued a statement saying that no remains of significance had been found. Newspapers that tried to investigate were told there was nothing to report. The bodies that were found were supposedly reburied. But where? Under what circumstances? The records are vague and contradictory. Contemporary newspaper accounts from 1901 and 1902 mentioned these discoveries, but downplay them. One article says that remains were discovered during excavation, but were handled appropriately. It provides no details about how many remains, where they were relocated, whether families were notified, whether religious or cultural ceremonies were observed. It's almost as if the entire incident was considered too embarrassing to discuss publicly. But the real mystery involves the scale of the discovery. Historians who have studied the original construction records suggest that thousands of remains may have been encountered. Not just a few skeletons, thousands. The Manhattan Burial Ground alone contained at least 4,000 burials. The Negro Potter's Field contained thousands more. If the subway route ran directly beneath these burial grounds, which historical evidence suggests it did, then workers would have encountered an enormous archaeological site. Yet the official records provide minimal documentation of these discoveries. What happened to these remains? Were they scientifically studied? Were they respectfully reburied? Were they simply dumped? The historical record is silent. For over 100 years, the story of New York City's first subway was told as a triumph of engineering and urban progress. The discovery of thousands of human remains was simply erased from the narrative. The death toll among workers was another major mystery. Official records state that approximately 35 workers died during the construction of the original subway line. But contemporary newspapers reported more deaths than this. Union records suggested that at least 50 workers died. But there's a deeper issue. Death records for immigrant workers were often poorly kept. If a worker died at a remote construction site, the death might not be officially reported. A worker who died from an infection or disease weeks after an accident might not be connected to the construction accident itself. Sandhogs, as the tunnel diggers were called, faced constant danger. Tunnel collapses killed workers instantly. Explosions from nitroglycerin charges used to break rock often caused horrific injuries. But the most mysterious deaths involved decompression sickness, which workers called the bends. This occurred when workers moved rapidly from high-pressure underground environments to normal atmospheric pressure above ground. The sudden change could cause nitrogen bubbles to form in the bloodstream, causing paralysis, pain, and death. Nobody understood what caused the bends at the time. Workers simply died in mysterious ways that couldn't be explained. On October 27, 1904, Mayor George McClellan rode the first official train. The train carried contractors, investors, and interborough rapid transit employees. At 2:35 in the afternoon, the first train made its run. At 7 in the evening, the subway opened to the general public. 50,000 people rode it on opening day. By the end of the day, the number had grown to 150,000. The 5-cent fare was affordable for working-class New Yorkers. The subway was immediately popular. The press celebrated the achievement with grand rhetoric. Editorials spoke of a triumph of American engineering, a monument to New York's forward-thinking leadership, a beacon of progress and modernity. Nobody mentioned the remains that had been disturbed in the excavation. Nobody mentioned the workers who had died. Nobody mentioned the African-American cemetery that had been built over. The narrative was one of pure progress. The New York City subway revolutionized life in Manhattan. It enabled rapid movement throughout the city. It accelerated real estate development in previously remote areas like the Upper West Side and Harlem. It connected downtown financial districts with uptown residential neighborhoods. By every economic measure, the subway was a success. It became the transportation system that defined New York City in the 20th century. But the cost of that achievement is still being uncovered. In 1991, during excavation for a federal building at Foley Square in downtown Manhattan, construction workers discovered what appeared to be remains from the African burial ground. The discovery sparked outrage and a serious historical investigation. Archaeologists were brought in. Skeletal remains were carefully excavated and studied. The remains represented African Americans and people of African descent, many of them enslaved people, who had been buried in a cemetery that had been intentionally forgotten by the city. The discovery of the African burial ground in 1991 raised the question, if human remains had been found near Foley Square in the 1990s, how many remains had been discovered a century earlier during the subway excavations? Why had there been no serious investigation? Why had the findings been covered up? The historical record provided few answers. In 2019, over 100 years after the subway opened, the Museum of the City of New York hosted an exhibition about the construction of the original subway. The exhibition was comprehensive. It covered the engineering, the workers, the challenges. But the section about remains discovered during excavation was minimal. A single paragraph acknowledged that human remains had been encountered. That was all. The story was still being downplayed, still being minimized, still being erased. The New York City subway carries over 5 million people daily through tunnels that lie beneath Manhattan streets. Most riders have no idea that those tunnels pass through or near historic burial grounds. Most don't know that thousands of human remains were encountered and handled in ways that remain unclear. Most don't know that the construction killed workers in ways that were never officially documented. The story of the subway has been told as a triumph of engineering and progress. But that story has a shadow made of forgotten remains and forgotten workers. The questions remain unanswered. How many people were actually buried in the African burial ground and the Negro potter's field? How many remains were encountered during the subway excavation? What happened to those remains? How many workers actually died during construction? Why were the deaths covered up? Why was the cemetery erased from historical records? Why has this story been hidden for over 100 years? In recent years, historians and archaeologists have begun to uncover these hidden stories. The African burial ground has been designated as a National Historic Landmark. Remains have been studied. Families have been identified. Respect has been given to the forgotten dead. But the story of what happened during the subway construction remains incomplete. Some questions may never be answered, but they deserve to be asked. If you want to uncover more hidden stories about American infrastructure, subscribe to Hidden America. Next time, we'll explore the construction of the Hoover Dam and discover the workers who died in ways that were never officially acknowledged. We'll investigate the engineer who risked everything to save lives, and we'll examine why some workers' names were completely erased from historical records. Subscribe now for more hidden infrastructure stories. And the next time you ride the subway beneath Manhattan streets, remember that you're traveling through history. History that includes not just engineering triumphs, but human stories
that have been deliberately forgotten.